Welcome to the Social Influence Unit. In this video, we'll cover conformity, obedience, prosocial behaviour, and crowd and collective behaviour. I've updated the PsychBoost app. Now it has over 500 GCSE flashcards, over 400 multiple choice quiz questions, and over 300 key terms to test your knowledge with. Of course, all based on the information I cover in these videos. I'm so confident you'll like my app. You can use all the features for Paper 1 for free. Only subscribe to Paper 2 if you know you'll find it helpful. You can also follow along with these videos by completing my worksheets, available on Patreon. Conformity. The psychologist Aronson gave a generally accepted definition of conformity. Conformity is a change in a person's behaviour or opinions as a result of real or imagined pressure from a person or group. A psychologist called Solomon Asch investigated the limits of conformity. He wanted to see if people would conform to a group on an unambiguous task, meaning if everybody else in the group was clearly wrong in their response, would the participant give the correct answer or just go along with the incorrect response? Male participants were told they were taking part in a visual perception task. They were tested alongside Confederates. Now, Confederates are people who pretend to be other participants, but are actually just part of the experiment. Sets of 2 white cards were shown to the group. One white card had a standard line on it, and the other second card had 3 comparison lines. The researcher showed a series of these cards to the group, and each time asked them in turn to match the standard line with one of the comparison lines. 12 of these sets of cards were critical trials, meaning all the Confederates gave the same incorrect response. Asch found that on the critical trials, 32% of the time people would conform and give clearly the wrong response. 75% of all participants conformed on at least one critical trial. So Asch concluded from these results that people will conform and give clearly incorrect answers due to a sense of group pressure. Asch conducted a series of variations of his original study to see what social factors influence conformity levels. Group size. When the number of Confederates was decreased, the conformity dropped. With just one Confederate, conformity was only 3%, with 2, 13.6%, and with 3, back up to 33%. But then conformity kind of leveled off, not increasing even with 15 Confederates. This suggests that only a few people are needed to cause significant social pressure. Anonymity. In this variation, participants could give their response in secret. Participants conformed far less in this condition. This suggests that people were only conforming because they felt a desire to fit in with the group. Task difficulty. In this variation, Asch reduced the differences between each of the comparison lines. This made it a little bit more difficult to see what the correct response was. When the participants were made less sure of the correct response in this way, conformity increased. So let's consider some evaluations of Asch, including the variations on his original study. Well, there are problems with Asch's methodology. It was a lab study in a very unusual artificial task, so we can question if the behaviour observed was really natural. Some of the participants, knowing that they were part of the study, might have guessed the other participants were set up to give the wrong answer and just kind of gone along with what they thought was expected of them. Demand characteristics. Asch can be criticised as lacking temporal validity, meaning that maybe these results applied to the 1950s, but not today. But some modern research has shown similar conformity effects in online groups. All of Asch's variations were conducted on groups of strangers. However, most examples of conformity happen around people we know, friends, family, or co-workers. It might be easier or harder to resist conformity around people we know and care about. So Asch's research might tell us little about how conformity works in the real world. Another criticism of Asch is a focus on social factors and conformity. In his original study, people resisted social pressure to conform on 68% of the critical trials, and 25% of people never conformed once. This suggests there might have been aspects to personality that influence conformity. Speaking of personality, let's look at disposition in relation to conformity. Well, we notice that some people are more conformist than others in the same social situation. It could be their personality, their set of personal characteristics. One aspect of personality that seems to be linked to conformity is a person's locus of control. Now, your locus of control is where you feel the power to control your life comes from, inside yourself or outside of yourself. People with an external locus of control feel they're controlled by outside forces, that they don't have the ability to change what happens to them. These people are thought to be more conformist than people with an internal locus of control. People with an internal locus of control feel they are in control of their own fate and can resist social pressure. Another aspect of someone's disposition is their level of expertise. It's thought that the more confident someone is with a topic, the less conformist they're likely to be. But they are likely to be conformist in areas that they're not an expert in. A criticism of locus of control is people tend to be more conformist in some situations than others, and a person's locus of control is thought to be stable. Changes in a person's level of conformity might be better explained by levels of expertise and the social factors identified by Asch. Where a positive evaluation of dispositional factors is it explains the behaviour of people who don't conform on a single trial of Asch's original study and the variations. They experience the same social pressure as those who weren't able to resist. There has been a replication of Asch by Perrin and Spencer. They reproduced the line-length study with engineering students, and in this study only one participant conformed to the group over 396 trials. So this lack of replication is a criticism of Asch's original study, but could be evidence of the role of expertise, with engineering students being more confident judging line length. Obedience. So, to define obedience, we would say that you're obedient when your behaviour is the result of the orders or demands of a person you see as an authority figure. A very famous psychologist called Stanley Milgram investigated obedience in one of the most famous psychology studies. He used the study as a demonstration of his agency theory that suggests all people are likely to be obedient to an authority figure. Milgram's experiment showed that 100% of participants acting as a teacher would give what they thought was a real, painful 300-volt electric shock to what they thought was a participant in the next room, all on the orders of a scientist acting as an authority figure. The obedience was so extreme, 65% of the participants actually gave a potentially lethal maximum voltage, even after the attended victim stopped shouting, so seemingly unconscious or dead. Milgram thought that we all had the potential to be obedient, but there were social factors, aspects of the situation, that made obedience more or less likely. Agency. We spend most of our time in an autonomous state, which means we feel in charge, and more importantly, responsible for our decisions. But we can give up our agency through something called an agentic shift. If this happens, we are now in an agentic state, and we allow the authority figure to make our decisions for us. We will follow their orders, and the responsibility we felt for our actions switches to them. Authority. We learn who is and who isn't a legitimate authority figure through socialization. We're taught that police and scientists are higher on the social hierarchy than people like postal workers and cleaners. We will often make judgments on if we should obey on the uniforms that people wear. Culture. The social hierarchy varies between cultures. We learn through socialization to respect the same types of people as our parents, our teachers, and our peers. An example, some cultures place older people higher on the social hierarchy than other cultures. Proximity. Your sense of personal responsibility for your action is increased the closer you are to the person you're hurting. Milgram conducted a variation of his study so that the participant and victim were in the same room. This reduced the number of participants that were obedient from 65 to 40%. When evaluating Milgram, we can consider real-world examples of people committing terrible acts while under orders. High-ranking Nazis like Eichmann, one of the main Nazis in charge of organizing the Holocaust, were particularly interesting to Milgram. At his trial, Eichmann claimed that he didn't feel responsibility for his actions as he was only following Hitler's orders. Milgram's own study is evidence in support of his agency theory, finding 65% of participants obeyed the authority figure to give a potentially lethal shock. However, all the participants in Milgram's research experienced the same social pressure to obey the authority figure, but 35% of people were able to resist the orders. The personality or disposition of these individuals may explain how these people were able to resist when so many people didn't. Later research showed that many of those people who resisted the authority figure had an internal locus of control. So Milgram suggested that all of us could be obedient, and if we were obedient or not depended on situational factors. But another theorist at that time, Adorno, disagreed with Milgram. Adorno thought that there were personality differences between people who were obedient and people who would resist authority. According to Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality, someone who is excessively obedient has a condition similar to a mental health disorder. An authoritarian personality starts an early childhood experience. There's trauma from a strict upbringing, likely with physical punishment. So, as we learn to respect authority through socialization, this excessive discipline from the parents leads to growing up with too much respect for authority and extreme obedience. Taking the idea of displacement from Freud, Adorno says these individuals feel anger towards their parents for the harsh discipline, but they displace this anger onto people they see as socially inferior, weaker targets like minorities. Adorno developed a way of measuring the authoritarian personality. It's called the F scale, and the F stands for fascism. This is a questionnaire measuring, among other things, obedience, respect for authority, a rigid cognitive style, which means these people see everything in black and white, and it also measured dislike for minorities. In evaluating Adorno's theory of the authoritarian personality, we can support the theory with research. Interviews were taken with the participants in Milgram's first 4 studies. Those that shocked to the full 450 volts scored higher on the F scale than participants who refused to continue. But Adorno's work, suggesting that the authoritarian personality is a personality type similar to a mental health condition, struggles to explain why the number of people who gave the full shocks in Milgram's study is so large, or why millions of people complied with the Holocaust. The authoritarian personality is effectively a criticism of people who are on the extreme right wing of politics. Opponents point out there have been authoritarians on the left of politics too. Prosocial behaviour. Psychologists are interested in the actions people do or don't take when they witness an emergency situation. This is called bystander behaviour. In what you'll notice is a bit of a pattern in these social influence videos. We're going to consider social and dispositional factors surrounding bystander behaviour. So, if we start by considering social factors, we're thinking about aspects of the environment that make it more or less likely that other people will help. The presence of others is a social factor. It's thought the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to help. That's a bit counterintuitive, but this is due to the diffusion of responsibility. If there are lots of people not taking action, then each one of those people feels less responsible because nobody else was helping. Another consideration is the cost of helping. Helping is a risk. You might be putting yourself in danger, it costs you your time, and what if the person you're trying to help kind of rejects you? It could be embarrassing. Those are all costs to helping. But not helping also has a cost. You might feel guilty for not helping. You might worry that other people will criticize you for not helping. There are also possible rewards. You might feel happiness after you've helped someone. So, you helping or not needs to be a balance between the risks and the rewards that might vary from situation to situation. As a positive evaluation for social factors in prosocial behaviour, we can use a study by Piliavin that we're going to cover in this video. But in a critical evaluation, we can consider there are many real-life emergency situations in which some people will be the first to help, even when everybody else stands by, even risking their own lives to help strangers. It's likely there are dispositional differences with the personalities of these people. So, of course, dispositional factors, traits, or personality factors of individuals that make them more or less likely to help. Firstly, similarity to victim. This one is a little bit depressing, but it's thought the more characteristics you share with someone who needs help, the more likely you are to give them that help. So this can be things like similar age, race, or group membership, like if you support the same sports team. But it's likely because identifying with them increases your empathy towards them. Another trait is an individual's level of expertise. If in an emergency situation you have specialist knowledge that can help, such as medical training, you're more likely to offer help. This is thought to be because you have the training, so you're more confident, and you're more familiar in medical situations. We could criticize the dispositional explanation for bystander behaviour by looking at the next bit of research by Piliavin as evidence for aspects of social situation being important on whether we help or we don't. So, let's look at Piliavin's study. Piliavin's subway study was a field study investigating bystander behaviour. Previous research on bystander behaviour had been conducted in the lab, but Piliavin thought that those studies totally lacked validity. Piliavin tested social factors influencing helping behaviour, such as appearance, on New York City subway. In one of those subway carriages, an actor would pretend to collapse. So, in some of those trials, the actor would have a bottle of alcohol and pretend to be drunk. And in other trials, the actor would have a walking stick to suggest that he was disabled. Not all of the other passengers on the carriage were passengers. Some were researchers who observed behaviour, measuring how long it took for the people to help the actor. What the researchers found was that when the actor was disabled, they were helped within 70 seconds of collapsing 90% of the time. But when the actor appeared to be drunk, they were only helped within 70 seconds 50% of the time. So the researchers concluded from these results that a person's characteristics, such as appearance, will influence the likelihood of them being helped. So this is seen as evidence of bystanders considering the cost of helping. When evaluating Piliavin's subway study, we can consider the advantages and disadvantages of using a field study method, and how that influences the validity of the findings. As a field study, we have to consider that Piliavin didn't have control of potential extraneous variables. There could have been uncontrolled differences between the drunk and disabled conditions, such as the individual differences between the passengers on the subway. Maybe more helpful people were on the subway by chance in the disabled condition. However, the advantage of using a field study is the behaviour of the passengers was very likely to be completely natural. The participants were unaware that they were part of an experiment. They were just in their normal environment, and while it's unusual for someone to collapse on the subway, it's a believable thing to happen. So we would say that the task has mundane realism. We can definitely criticise the ethics of Piliavin's study. It's accepted that participants should give their informed consent before taking part in any experiment. But in this study, everyone in the carriage who wasn't a researcher or the actor was a participant. They did not give consent. And as they were all entering and leaving the carriage at different stops, it wasn't possible to debrief any of them and tell them they are part of a psychology study. It may have caused some emotional harm to people who felt guilty for not helping the actor, not knowing they were just in an experiment. Crowd and collective behaviour. The definition of collective behaviour is simple. It's the actions people take when they're part of a group. And we see crowds taking part in both collective pro and antisocial behaviour. Prosocial behaviour is constructive, so happy and helpful. Imagine groups of people at music festivals or taking time to peacefully protest a good cause. We can also see prosocial group behaviour in disasters when people rush to help victims. On the other hand, a crowd's antisocial behaviour is when the group is disruptive. So they might vandalise property, riot, and be aggressive towards the police. Often people who have never committed antisocial behaviour before will be swept along with the group. So of course, as with the other social influence videos, let's discuss social and dispositional factors behind this. One social factor is deindividuation. We normally have a sense of a socialized individual identity. You know who you are and you feel responsible for your choices. You lose that when you're deindividuated as part of a large crowd. You're hard to identify, so you feel anonymous. You identify with the group. Now you can follow the group's actions, breaking social norms you never would as an individual, like taking part in a riot. Social loafing is another social factor. People often put in less effort when they're part of a group. This is because in a group task, because there are so many people contributing, any individual contributing less isn't as visible as it would be if they all completed the task alone. Culture is also a social factor. There's a distinction between two types of culture: collectivist, often Eastern societies, and individualistic, often Western societies. If you're from a collectivist society, you see your responsibility as playing a positive role as part of a group. But if you're from an individualistic society, you're far more likely to see your own success and needs as more important. A positive evaluation on understanding the social influences on collective behaviour is how we can apply those ideas. Managers who understand social loafing can get everyone working hard on group projects. Police understanding deindividuation can help stop protesters turning into rioters by banning masks and using CCTV. However, a criticism of social factors is not everyone goes along with crowds' behaviour. Some will work hard on a group project, even if nobody else does. And some people would never take part in a riot. And so this is likely due to personality or dispositional factors. Another positive evaluation, focused on de-individuation, is there are many examples of groups of people intentionally de-individuating themselves, sometimes before violent acts. Think of football hooligans with the same kit, tribal societies with war paint, and even members of the army all with the same haircuts and uniforms. Let's now consider dispositional factors that might explain collective behaviour. Locus of control is an aspect of personality that might make it more or less likely that someone will go along with a crowd's antisocial behaviour or not. Someone with an internal locus of control feels they're in control of their own fate and responsible for their own actions, so will likely resist the crowd. But someone with an external locus of control will likely go along with the crowd's behaviour. We can consider a person's morality as a dispositional factor. This is an individual's sense of what's right and wrong behaviour. They might believe deeply that violence is wrong, and if a crowd becomes violent or antisocial, just step away. Morality is something that is developed through socialization, and some people have a greater moral strength than others. To evaluate dispositional factors, the theory does explain how what was a peaceful protest can turn violent. Some members with weak morals commit antisocial actions, and those with an external locus of control go along with the behaviour. We can also explain violent crowds with convergence theory, and that's that people with weak morals are attracted to violent crowds. However, the morality disposition explanation struggles to explain why so often people without any previous criminal record and hold down law-abiding lives will take part in a riot or football hooliganism. These people are better explained by social explanations of crowd behaviour. I want to thank all my patrons for their support. They allow me to work part-time and make PsychBoost, and in return, they get extra resources. For example, GCSE patrons get digital worksheets, exam question walkthroughs, and these videos as a set of teaching slides.